Adam, this is perhaps the most important conversation of the entire week. And it's something that isn't getting enough coverage. We have been deficient at FreightWaves, but so has the industry, about the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. You tweeted this, and I think this is something that's really important, is that there's 177,000 drivers that are at risk or have lost their CDL privileges. Tell us what is going on.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a pretty provocative tweet.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, back in 2020, the FMCSA decided to institute what's called a clearinghouse, and it was a way for the industry to standardize the drug testing process all the way across the board. Working for mega carriers, you know that they have a process in place from drug and alcohol violations through their DQF process, but when it comes out to the small carrier perspective, there was no real streamlined approach to where you have drivers going in and out of different types of situations. So what the FMCSA decided to do back in 2016, actually, in 2020, they actually started implementing what's called a clearinghouse. That's a way for me to be able to validate if Craig worked for Schneider and then now all of a sudden he wants to go work for ABC Trucking. This is one way for me to be able to determine whether or not he had any drug or alcohol violation. So the first part of the ruling was to implement the actual FMCSA clearinghouse, which standardized the drug testing process. Since 2020, interestingly enough, over almost 400,000 drug violations alone have been captured through the clearinghouse system. So round two was saying, hey, you know what? Instead of you just being grounded, Craig, now we're going to ground you, but now we're going to also take the keys to the car. And I think that what happened is that they made the decision to not only, because obviously when you go through the clearinghouse process and you're considered prohibited, you're supposed to stop driving. Now, does that happen all the time? No. So what they decided to do was say, hey, you know what? The next step of this element is to remove your keys. And because states are funded through that, all 50 states agreed to receive funding from them. Now they have to comply with the process of actually removing the actual CDL privilege. And that's the difference.
So the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse has been around for a couple of years, 2020. There was a lot of predictions of the significant loss to driving privileges, that we would lose a portion of truck drivers. I think retrospect, that doesn't appear to be the case.
I think that we have to look at it from a perspective of enforcement. You know, here's the thing and the crazy thing about it is that we deal with small carriers day in and day out, and you would be surprised at how many of them, questions that we get through the support portal, like, hey, what is the clearinghouse? Hey, do I have to do a query? Hey, this guy's showing prohibited. Can I hire him? So it's a lot of lack of knowledge there from that perspective. But then when you look at it from an enforcement perspective, I think it's going to be one of those slow matriculations that we're going to have to look at the out of service ratings for the driver side. So right now, anytime a driver goes to a weigh station, 21% of the time you're going to be put out of service for the truck, maybe 8% of the time because of whether it be fit for duty or any other driver violation. So if we start watching that over the next couple of months, if the states are really going through the enforcement process, which we would anticipate that they're going to do so because they're having a little bit of pressure, if they start going through that enforcement process, we would start seeing that out-of-service number go up. But then most importantly, my feeling is now most importantly with the visibility and lens on it, now a lot more small carriers are going to have their eyes open and they're going to be impacted because now the CDL is no longer a CDL. Typically, when prior to this, the CDL didn't get downgraded. So if I hire a driver that's prohibited in a clearinghouse, I run his MVR, it's going to be an active CDL. But now, if I run his CDL, it's not going to be an active CDL.
So let's talk a little bit about what causes a driver to be actually in the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse.
So here's another concerning piece. So we go back prior to 2020, and prior to 2020, there was no clearinghouse. You know, you can start a trucking company, go through the process. You're supposed to drug test pre-employment, and you're supposed to have a regular process where it's randomized to where there's random drug testing in place. If I'm a driver and I am working for a company and that company's following all the rules, the first thing I have to do is I have to go through a pre-employment drug screening. Now, there are some insurance companies that require hair follicles. There's some that require just urine only. Urine only is the DOT requirement. But in that process, throughout the year as well, there's supposed to be a randomized process with that company to where it can say, hey, Adam, it's your turn. You've got 24 hours to go to a DOT testing facility and get drug tested. If I fail or I say, you know what, I'm not doing that, then my carrier is supposed to immediately report that to the clearinghouse, So that way that would showcase that driver prohibited.
So you said there's been 400,000 drivers.
Almost. It was 360-some thousand drivers since 2020 that has reported a drug violation stemming from marijuana all the way down to opioids.
And alcohol is part of that or no?
Alcohol is not part of that. That's just the drug part.
That's just the drug part.
Drug
and
violation.
Predominance of that is cannabis or marijuana, right?
Marijuana is number one, but cocaine is number two.
Cocaine is number two.
Cocaine is number two.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, we're at 400,000 drivers, or almost 400,000. We got to 177,000. Where's the delta between those two numbers?
So I think that when you had your 400,000 drivers that actually had a violation, the delta is that not only you had some that just decided to just not to proceed, but then you also had some that complied with the RTD status. And the return to duty is you got to go through the counseling program, you got to commit to testing, and then sometimes what they'll do is they'll do a 4 or 5 time testing through the year to bring you back on board. But that number comes down as more people participate and go through that. Those drivers are considered SAP drivers.
They're considered what?
SAP, S-A-P. Those are substance abuse program drivers.
Okay.
The crazy thing about it is that, and to nobody's fault of them own, but when we saw in COVID, when we saw the need for additional capacity, particularly from the small carrier side, we saw a lot of SAP drivers participating again in the entire program of being instituted back into the system, followed RTD status, things of that nature. The one thing that I noticed that was very, very odd about that 177 number is that out of the 177,000, it was like 120,000 of them didn't even start the RTD process. So you had over 123,000 drivers that had a violation, that knew that they had a violation, but they say, well, you know what, this market's trash. I'm not going to even go out. I'll just go work at a warehouse or something. And that's really where we saw the gap in the numbers.
Do you think a portion of those drivers just said, screw it, I'm just going to drive and not even go through the process, and I'm just going to risk getting caught? Or do you truly think that those drivers have left the industry?
You'd be a fool to think that there isn't a good mix of the two.
I mean, I've said this, is like, if there is a rule to cheat, you'll find it in trucking. Like, just not, vast majority of people don't, but there is a really bad subsegment of our population in trucking that if there's a rule to be broken, they're going to absolutely do it.
I mean, think about it. Okay, so, all right, there's a rule in place that you're not allowed to use drugs and operate a commercial motor vehicle. But since 2020, we almost had over 500,000 violations. And the thing about those violations are they're completely randomized. So they were either, hey, I found, paraphernalia in a truck doing a roadside inspection, or B, you got caught with a random, and at that particular randomized time, you had a substance in your system that was illegal. So let's think about the amount of drivers, and I'm not going to speak out of ignorance, but you got to think about the amount of drivers on the roads these days that are probably under a substance that are not being calculated through the system.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking 400,000 drivers. What are there, 3.5 million commercial drivers in the U.S.?
Yeah, 3.5.
And is it strictly commercial drivers, CDLs, all forms of CDLs, or is it strictly in certain portions of the market?
So all CDL portions. So whether you have, hey, I'm local dump truck or local grain hauler, as long as I'm falling under the USDOT requirements, that's going to fall under that pool. But the thing that I find that's so interesting enough is that when you get into these randomized programs, when you're a small carrier, less than 5 trucks, and you're going into these randomized programs, I've seen drivers go 2 years without being pulled for random. And so I think that what happens with that is that you just got to look at the entire element. Do we go into a phase of we're just going to start drug testing every driver and just absolutely have maybe a midpoint? I think that there's a problem, transparently, that there's a problem. There's a substance abuse problem, and then it's spilling over into the industry. And I think that before that, if you think that 400,000 drivers right now between the last 4 years got pulled and got said, hey, you know what, you did something you wasn't supposed to from a drug and alcohol violation, what happened prior to that? And so what concerns me from a capacity perspective, and this is where the capacity side ties into me. Before 2020, before the COVID pandemic, we had the influx of folks. We had no processes in place to say, hey, you know what, you can't play the game. What happens when we go into another market swing where capacity is tight again? Now we got a process in place. Now we have a return to duty process. We got a fitness for duty process. We got a clearinghouse process. So if a driver gets pulled for a violation and they get showcased that violation, the state's required to, and they remain in prohibited status without doing RTD, the state's required to pull that CDL down to a standardized license. So I think that.
So he can't drive anymore?
Can't drive, no.
Illegally can't drive?
he can't drive, right? Legally, he can't drive. And if you're a small carrier, which primarily the market is placed of, if you're a small carrier and you do that, then you're potentially risking yourself on being fined $6,000 from the FMCSA
Wow.
for every time that happens.
So let's talk a little bit about the 177,000. So 400,000 of these drivers have been in the database. A large portion of them have gone, more than half, right?
Yeah.
Gone through the reinstatement process.
Yeah.
They've completed the counseling. Is that a long, arduous process?
So the counseling, it just depends on the violation, depends on the substance, obviously, but the actual RTD process is the repetitive randomized drug test.
So they have to continue to show that they're sober.
Right.
And maintain sobriety. There's, I imagine, some classes and counseling they have to go through. So, and how often are they having to test? Is it random as well as?
So it's random, and typically it's anywhere between 4 and 6 tests.
Okay.
Once they complete that process and they showcase it, because they'll have someone that's kind of like a case manager that kind of walks them through. Once they complete that process and they showcase that they're clean all the way through, then they'll be considered back into the RTD process is good to go, but then they'll be considered a SAP driver.
Okay.
And
does that stay permanently on the record?
So here's the thing: is that you'll always have access to those records. So through the clearinghouse, now you'll have visibility going forward if you've ever failed a drug test. And so the stigma, if you want to talk about stigmas, and if I really want to look at there, it's going to be a stigma like, oh man, Craig failed a drug test.
So the bigger carriers, which are basically ran by their insurance companies these days, if you want to be completely frank, are far less likely to hire those drivers, because the last thing that they want is a driver ended up in a courtroom because of some inevitable accident that may happen. And, a lawyer comes out and says, this guy was a SAP driver, right?
Yeah, and
you hired him knowing he had a cocaine.
And you knew he had it. But the crazy thing about that is that when you look at it, and I even go back to some of the recruiting agencies that really kind of took flight, that were placing drivers for, all companies, large and small. Some of the drivers were a large portion of drivers that they were recruiting back into the fold were SAP drivers. So you got small carriers that were taking on SAP drivers, and then now as a small carrier with a SAP driver, now your driver is going to be, obviously, you're going to have that microscope, that you're going to have that viewpoint where, hey, you're going to have a driver that's going to have to get pulled for testing. And the craziest thing about it is
and they got to pay for the testing, right?
Yeah, you got to
pay.
Well, you do have to pay for the testing under the consortium. It's not much. But one of the things that's so unique about it, Craig, that I continuously say that this is the undercurrent, and people don't realize, is that small carriers, and I don't want to talk about all, but there's a large majority of them that are starting companies that just don't know. When I say we get questions in the support box, like, hey, Craig was prohibited. Can we hire this guy? No. And you would be surprised on how frequent that comes across.
Well, I mean, I've said this, Adam, is, we cover a lot of major stories from the trucking industry, and we like to think that we're on top of all the major stories, and we certainly were when the alcohol and clearinghouse was first put in there. And it wasn't actually until your tweet that you pointed out that we had been missing a pretty important part of the story, was that the alcohol and drug and clearinghouse was already in effect, but the second phase of it was coming. And it was actually you pointing it out on X that really got my attention, that this is a much bigger portion of the drug and alcohol clearinghouse than the first phase was to begin with.
I think it's the most important, because like I said at first, I'm saying, Craig, you're grounded.
Yeah.
The car's sitting in the driveway, you're grounded. Well, I look at the camera in the middle.
No, my keys were taken away.
Now
I've been put into, I'm locked in my room and not allowed out.
Now your keys are taken away, and if I got to go get groceries, I can't send Craig to do it now because he doesn't have the keys to the car anymore.
Yeah, or, I would probably use a better analogy for my younger kids, which is I've taken their phones away.
No, it's even worse. It's even harsher. So when you think about that, and here's the thing, and I think that the most important part to consider is that the enforcement, I think, is going to be different. I think the enforcement now on a roadside, when the roadside officer runs the CDL, now you don't have a valid CDL. Now you're.
So let's talk about the 177,000 drivers that are currently in prohibited status. Do you have an official number on what actually, when this went into effect 3 days ago, do you have the actual number?
Nah, so when you go to the Clearinghouse website, they're usually about a month behind.
Okay, we're shocking. It's government data.
It's government data, so it's going to be behind. So it's about a month behind. So I would say by the end of November, we'll be able to get actually December is probably when we're going to get a best lens on what the impact has
Yeah.
in terms of that.
Is it fair to assume that the 177 is an approximation?
Yeah. So, I mean, no, 177 is approximate, and it's based on their data. So
Yeah.
if the clearinghouse's data saying, hey, it was actually 178, 160, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's their data. That's who they show that, hey, these guys that had a CDL, they're prohibited, and they're still in prohibited status because they have not completed the RTD process. You had a large majority of them that decided that they weren't going to start the RTD process, and then you had the small minority of them that were in the midst of the RTD process but have not completed that process.
All right, so let's talk about the home 177, because I think this is a really important part of the driver capacity question, which is, ultimately our role in the market is so much centered on the supply and demand elements in the freight economy. That's where we at FreightWaves spend an enormous amount of energy really studying the supply and demand elements. This is on the supply and capacity side, is these 177,000. What I'm hearing from you is that this is ultimately going to live or die in terms of removing capacity or removing these drivers on enforcement.
Yes.
And you said something that is interesting to me as I'm listening to hear you talk, is it's when drivers are going to the weigh stations that's when we're likely to find the drivers without CDLs. Is that fair?
I think that's in the beginning. I think that's fair, and I think what you'll find it's funny. And I want this is one of the things I want to keep an eye on. We always talk about Blitz Week, and we look at Blitz Week. We see how much capacity is removed from Blitz Week just because you got drivers that don't want to go through a weigh station.
Yeah, for sure.
What is that going to look like on the first time around now that we have enforcement in place?
Right.
I think that is going to change some things in terms
And
of
is your view that the states are actually going to do this?
I believe so.
You said there's funding.
There's funding that's
There's
tied
money
to it.
associated.
There's money that's tied to it. They're required to follow the steps. Now, here's the thing. There's some states that have already started the process prior to the 18th to get into compliance, but the majority of the states haven't already played that game.
Does the fines, the $6,000 fines, that go to the states?
It goes to the states, correct?
Oh, they're going to enforce this.
So they're going to enforce it. It's going to be an enforcement thing, and I really, really, truly believe that it's going to impact. So mega carriers, I never worry about.
Because they have the insurance companies.
They have the insurance companies, and their processes are locked-tight. They're airtight. Smaller carriers, less than 10 trucks.
Yeah.
There's some great ones that's doing the fantastic job of keeping everything in order.
Yeah.
There's a good majority of them that don't. And that's where, when you think about the amount of capacity, and you know this, FreightWaves is really good about expressing this. We all know where the majority of capacity comes from in the United States.
All small carriers.
It's all small carriers.
Yeah.
So what happens when you have that 5 to 10 truck range, right? That now that had drivers that were prohibited or drivers that they weren't doing the proper things in terms of return to duty status, what happens? It's going to be a slow burn. I don't think it's going to be a, hey, you know what? It's today's November 20th.
Yeah.
It's not like we're going to throw a match into a gasoline and just poof, now all of a sudden.
Sure.
But it is going to be a slow burn because now not only do we have the 177, but we've got the people every day now that instead of just saying, hey, Craig, you're grounded, now you got the people saying, hey, Craig, you're grounded, but now I'm giving you your keys. So now that's an ongoing process that we haven't had before.
Yeah.
So when you think about the capacity crunch and what that could do, it's going to be different.
Yeah, I think there's two portions of this that I think are incredibly interesting. One is the current 177,000 drivers. But then it's also, we had a debate about the driver shortage this morning. It also is going to make it more challenging, we'll say, for some of the smaller carriers to hire drivers because the supply of drivers that don't have violations are going to be lessened.
Absolutely. And here's the thing, just think about it. Since 2020, and I'm not talking about alcohol, and we're talking about 177, I want to talk about 400,000. Since 2020, there have been 400,000 just drug violations alone. As a small carrier, when we go through the process of bringing on and trying to recruit drivers, it is so frequent that we receive SAP.
Wow.
SAP. It speaks to the larger issue within the nation itself, and we all can agree that that's present. But just think about the ongoing pain point that this is going to create.
Yeah.
And I think that the enforcement side of it is going to change the way capacity is viewed, specifically on the marketplace from a small carrier insertion perspective, because now it's I'm taking Craig's keys.
Yeah, it's harder to get. It's harder. The small carriers could feed off of the rejected drivers from the bigger carriers. You know, if they entered into the clearinghouse, a larger carrier would say no. But your case, I think you made a very solid case that that's going to be far more difficult. And you said something. I think the enforcement, the fact that there is $6,000 available to the states. Like, I lived in a city in Texas, in Westlake, Texas. I lived outside of Westlake. It was a 4-lane divided highway that had a 30-mile-per-hour zone. I got like 8 tickets in a year because you couldn't help but drive 32, 35 miles per hour. Like, driving 30 in a divided highway is hard. It's because they made a lot of money just on these speed traps. And what you're saying, I think, is incredibly interesting, is that there is a compelling case to be made that the states will enforce these rules because there is money on the line to do so.
Why not? And then on top of that, now you're flexing your muscles and saying, hey, look what we did. We're making the motor and public highway safer because look what we did. We took 300,000 people that showcased that they were drug and alcohol violators. 177,000 of them decided that, you know what, we're not going to begin the RTD process. So now you're showcasing that you look better for the American people at that point.
Adam, this is a story I want to have you back because I think I'd love to get the updates on this. This is a really important story, and it does once again reinforce the fact that this freight recession that we've been living in a pretty miserable time for many parts of the market. Another case for that supply and demand balance could come into effect. Even if we're talking 10%, it is big enough of an impact because of how marginally close we are in that balance to where it could be a pretty significant capacity crunch.
I mean, if you say it's 10%, we're taking 17,000 trucks off.
That's not small.
That is not small, not in any market. If we said now, tomorrow, that we got 17,000 less trucks and trailers to move up and down the highways, I think that would flip the market.
Yeah, I think so. Well, Adam, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.